Thanks, Tigran, and thanks everyone for being involved in this. I'm going to have no pictures except the ones that are up here, just to give a break from the hegemony of PowerPoint. Mostly, I think I want to thank Ali because with his talk, now I don't have to say that I am merely Matthew's evil twin, and that you could just put a negative sign in front of everything he said, and that would be my talk. So I don't have to do that at this point. Instead, I'm going to get you to try and remember back 50 years ago tomorrow, right? 50 years ago tomorrow is when the People's Park riots in Berkeley started. For some of us who actually lived through them, hard to believe that it was 50 years ago, but it was. And what's even more hard to believe, I think, is that People's Park still exists for now. Stolen from the University of California on April 20th, 1969 by a motley collection of anti-war militants, community activists, and eco-freaks, the plot of land that became People's Park had originally been slated for student housing when the university assembled it through a combination of eminent domain and outright purchase in the late 1950s. Now it is slated to be student housing again, about 1,000 beds. Sharing the site, according to the university's latest plan, which was announced just about a year ago, will be an open space available to residents as well as the surrounding community, with up to 100 beds of supportive housing for the homeless. The university will lease the People's Park site to a for-profit private developer who will build private student accommodations in accordance with UC guidelines, as well as the open space itself, the remnant of People's Park. There is no guarantee that this housing will be offered to students at below market rate, or even actually at current market rates. Indeed, members of the Student Senate Housing Committee fear that the proposed development, together with 8 others that the university is contemplating, will in fact increase upward pressure on Berkeley's already exceptionally expensive rental housing market. A bed in a double room in the university's most recent privately built but university-run apartment complex rents for $1,783 a month, and a single room in the same complex rents for $1,972 a month. This is hardly affordable housing, even for fairly wealthy California students. The supportive housing, for which no financing has yet been secured or even applied for, will be built by a separate nonprofit developer, also not yet identified, to whom the land will be leased to house a subset of Berkeley's homeless population with special needs, also, again, not yet identified. There is much that is attractive, however, about this plan for supportive housing, not least that it will increase Berkeley's number of supported beds by about 300%. But there is much to make one wary also. In all the considerable UC Berkeley media information about its plans, everything about this aspect, the supportive housing, of the development remains exceedingly vague and often quite pie in the sky. It seems clear from what the university says that the supported housing will only ever be built if the city or a nonprofit developer can organize the receipt of a whole slew of special grants from a decreasing federal pie, as well as state sources, if the developer receives a bunch of non-statutory tax breaks, and if, well, a whole lot more. For its part, the open space, and UC Berkeley is very careful to never use the term public space in its discussion of the site, this open space is meant to be a welcoming community space where eyes on the street, or in this case a park or plaza, will keep everyone safe by assuring that local residents will feel some sense of, in their words, ownership over the space. Plans for what this space, comprising perhaps a quarter of the current park's footprint, plans for what this space will look like or contain do not yet exist. But what is promised is that there will be a specially designated sidewalk at the east end of the current People's Park, separated from this open space by the student housing. And this special strip will memorialize People's Park's turbulent history with plaques in its pavement and perhaps on its vertical features, to quote from the plans, such as they are. There may also be some sort of a memorial sculpture. Gone will be the free stage, the free box, and the community gardens that have long defined the park, its use, and its meanings. Gone also will be most of what's left of the by now mature trees that crowded the west and east ends of People's Park. These plans, in fact, represent a significant departure from the university's previous most recent plans for developing the park, in which the whole site would remain an open space, even a commons, if now heavily programmed and meticulously designed. Which these earlier ones were announced a decade ago, but put on hold by the financial crisis, but nonetheless seem to be moving slowly forward by fits and starts as the university has intermittently chopped down trees, cleared out community gardens, or otherwise engaged in what it calls routine heavy maintenance. Itself routinely conducted before dawn, often in the dead week between Christmas and New Year, and just as often with cops deployed in their dozens. Indeed, at least 50 city police, sheriff deputies, highway patrol officers attended the most recent bout of heavy maintenance, which began at 5 a.m. on December 28, 2018. Cops are no strangers to the park at other times of the day. Every evening at dusk, police clear the park of all who remain there, scattering homeless people into the surrounding neighborhoods or herding them towards Civic Center Park to the west. If People's Park is a haven for the homeless, as every single news article and press release always says in unvarying language, then it is so only during the day. The university and the police have forbidden overnight sleeping in the park for half a decade now. During the day, both homeless people and the police are also frequent visitors. By university's account, up to 2,000 police reports a year are made for activities in the park. The vast majority of these are petty, like noise violations or drug-narcotics contacts, but some are serious. There were 5 rapes in the park between 2013 and 2018, and at the end of April this year, a man was murdered in the park. But in fact, it was one of a string of murders and shootings over 2 days by the same man in the Bay Area and in Nevada, and it's the only one for which the place is described where the murder happened in all the news accounts that I could find. The university is always careful to indicate that homeless people tend to be the victims of crime in People's Park, often crimes of opportunity given People's Park's open design, they say, rather than the homeless being the perpetrators of them. Even if the nearby Merchants Association on Telegraph Avenue continues to insist that it is precisely the presence of homeless people in the park that attracts crime to the area. Though in the past, numerous university plans to redevelop People's Park either as a programmed, designed park or for housing have fallen through, or been successfully resisted, it seems like this time the university might just succeed. Significantly, the city itself strongly supports plans to build student and supportive housing on the site. It is often actually opposed to any kind of development. And the very inclusion of some supportive housing, however vague the promise, has garnered the support of some groups working with homeless people who in the past have opposed the park's redevelopment. But perhaps most important is that Berkeley's and the Bay Area's housing crisis has made building here feel imperative. In April 2018, just before UC announced its plans for People's Park, the university was sued by an organization called Save Berkeley's Neighborhoods, which claimed the university has increased student enrollment by more than 5 times what it outlined in its own 2020 long-range plan, and in doing so has exacerbated housing shortages, displaced low-income residents as students have outcompeted them for housing, and thereby driven up rents and increased homelessness. The plans to redevelop People's Park might be read as a first answer to that lawsuit. So that's one way to read this. There are a lot of other ways that we could read them, and I think a lot of the things that have been talked about today are some of these ways that we can understand what's going on. Thinking about the way the park is, or there's a conflict between a park as a place that's welcoming, a place for retreat, a place of conflict, and so forth. And I've written ad nauseum about that, so I'm just going to skip over all those pages in the interest of time and tell a slightly different story about the park in relationship to what I just said. If UC Berkeley is successful in developing People's Park this time, with student housing, and especially if, as seems likely, it is able to do so through a partnership with a for-profit developer, then it will have been so, I would like to suggest, because it has managed to shift what was a public space question into a housing question. This was, of course, exactly the strategy that Rudolph Giuliani attempted 2 decades ago when he launched his war on New York's community gardens, but he was only partially successful. While vital politically, what this shift accomplishes, in fact, this is precisely why it works, is the masking of the fact that, that public space questions and housing questions are really, in fact, the same question and a different one. Not directly a question of shelter or space, but in essence a question of landed property and its role in contemporary post-industrial capitalism. Already in 1970, Henri Lefebvre had started talking about the urban revolution. This revolution is marked not merely by the fact that even then we were well on our way to seeing the percentage of the global population residing in cities surpass that living in the countryside, but especially by the fact that the predominant mode of circulation and accumulation of capital was rapidly shifting. If the primary locus of surplus value production within the industrial era was the factory, that is, no longer was the movement of goods the primary means by which new value is produced as it was under mercantile capitalism, then increasingly the factory itself is being surpassed by city space as the locus of accumulation. Just as the circulation of goods and other mercantile practices remained vitally important but subservient in the industrial era, now increasingly industrial production is coming to support production of new value through the built environment. The city is becoming the new factory. This is the urban revolution. Under the urban revolution, the spatial relations of production are turned on their head. Before, built environments were constructed to support the production, circulation, and consumption of goods, from factories or the industrial fields to the consumers, or to support the reproduction of workers and managers and their families who affected this production, circulation, and consumption. In this process, the built environment was always significantly commodified, of course, with the built environment often built and bought and sold like other commodities. But its purpose resided more in its use than its exchangeability. Now the built environment is built precisely to be exchanged. Industrial production and circulation support the production of values and their realization in the built environment. It used to be that some capital had to be fixed in place in the built environment so that other capital could circulate and compound. Now some capital must circulate so that other capital may be fixed in place. This is a fundamental reorientation of the ways and reasons capital circulates, and it's a risky one. So now there's a whole long argument that can be made here about the role of finance in all of this, which mitigates and compounds that risk at the same time, and especially about the vital and contradictory importance of the slow capital turnover times in the built environment for the growing importance of urban space and the built environment as the locus of accumulation. But that will have to wait for another day, since we only have 20 minutes and I don't want to bore you too much. In these circumstances, I want to suggest instead we should be focusing on rent, because rent takes on a new importance. Rent has never been unimportant in modern capitalism, but in the classic theories, rent was a means by which surpluses were expropriated, which also had the effect of equalizing the rate of profit. Now rent is the primary means by which surplus values are realized. This is an important distinction. No longer is landed property parasitic on the productive sector as it was understood in much classical Marxism, and indeed in much neoclassical economy more broadly, merely a mechanism by which some portion of the surplus product is expropriated by a non-productive class. Rather, rent is the whole point. Land itself, as long as it has been humanly transformed, has become property, and the things built on that land are endowed with value, and that value must be released so as to re-enter circulation, production, and accumulation processes, while the apparent value of the landscape is preserved or even increased. Rent must, magically it seems, be able to circulate, to change the form of a solid commodity into realized value in the form of money, and it must stay put. This magic has a couple of components, and if I really wanted to bore you, more than I already have, then I would now turn to a long discussion of differential rent 1, differential rent 2, and the distinction between absolute and monopoly rent. But instead, let me just make the simple point that production within and through the built environment, as when existing landscapes are remade, creates a landscape that is at once distinguishable and commensurable. It is distinguishable in the simple sense that the things on the land are different. Houses here, rebuilt warehouses over there, a few pocket parks on the other side of the street. It is commensurable in the sense that through rent, all land is fully tradable. An acre of land here is worth the same as a hectare over there. The dialectic between distinguishability and commensurability is, of course, true of all commodities. It is what makes what market segmentation is all about. But the landscape, that is, property in land and property in buildings, landscapes, and infrastructure, is different from other commodities in that it is itself immovable. The price of such property, which is to say its realizable value, is thus dependent on other properties in ways that other commodities are not so dependent on their neighbors or competitors. The rent surface of a city is spatially relational. No parcel of land can be transformed in any way without affecting the prices of all other lands within some radius. No piece of land can be removed from the commodity world, can be decommodified, as People's Park substantially was over its 50-year history, without impacting the overall rent surface. Likewise, no property can be reinserted back into the commodity world without having such an effect. No property can deteriorate or conversely be renovated without affecting values across the rent surface. For this reason, every property owner has a direct, not an indirect, but a direct interest in the property of every other owner. And to the degree landed property in the built environment has become the predominant basis for ongoing capital accumulation, then this system as a whole can tolerate very little deviance. A place like People's Park is a direct and systemic threat, if at larger scales, perhaps a minor one, to ongoing urban production and the realization of value through rent. But the larger scales do not matter, for, as I've already suggested, landed property and the built environment it supports is immovable. And capital that is immovable is always capital at risk. Neighboring property owners, as well as city tax collectors, feel this risk viscerally. For this reason, a place like what People's Park might become under UC's plans, with its safer, more designed, more attractive public space, which also honors the memory of the park's turbulent past, with its market rate housing for students, and maybe even, I think, especially with its managerial interventions into the lives of homeless people in the city, should the supportive housing ever come to pass, ought, as has long been hoped for by the big property owners in Berkeley, to say nothing of the real estate investment trusts that will be behind the housing developer, it must transform a public space from one that threatens production to an albeit smaller one that supports it. And not only that, as the proceeds from rent have become an increasingly important component of UC Berkeley's operating budget, as has been the case over the last decade since the crisis, the university has a lot more to gain by People's Park's transformation than just the more welcoming space for students and the public that it trumpets. So what I'm arguing in short is that among all the other ways we understand public space, from its design to the contestation over rights that are encapsulated in it, it is of increasingly importance, if we want to understand better public space's future, that we also analyze public space as property. Of course, there is already a large literature on property and public space, but this literature focuses especially on the social and political relations of property and their structuring effects, more than the economic relations of property. And here I should be talking about the critical urban literature rather than, say, the real estate literature, which focuses on exactly what I'm talking about here. The social and political relations of property are, of course, deeply important. Lynn Staley and I have devoted a book to them, after all. But what I'm trying to suggest now is that the economics of public space as property are becoming even more important in the contemporary city. At People's Park, it is not just that homeless people who hang out in the park are seen to be a threat to the vitality of the nearby business district or to surrounding property values because they deter shoppers and so forth, but also, and increasingly, that the very existence of the space itself threatens the ongoing production and realization of value in the spaces of the city, however minor this threat may actually be. And yet, and this is, I think, vitally important, at the same time, the continued existence of People's Park, the continued existence of People's Park, however fraught that existence has been vital to the current plans to profit off Berkeley's ongoing development, whether that profit flows back into the university's budget or into the accounts of the REIT's owners. In its pronouncements concerning the student housing crisis in Berkeley, the university has made much about how People's Park is one of the few suitable sites for development. It is suitable, of course, because it is big, open, there are no buildings that have to be cleared out, close to campus, and depressed in value. As the university has made clear, just about anywhere else in the city, and indeed further afield in university-owned or controlled property in Richmond and San Francisco, the costs of clearing and preparing the land for construction, to say nothing of purchasing it in the first place, if necessary, would make any student housing, not merely affordable student housing, impossible. Because People's Park is still People's Park these 50 years later, it is ripe for development and the delicious possibilities of rent such development entails. Thank you.